Friends, as we're taking our seats, I'll go ahead and get us started. I'm Joshua McManaway. I'm on faculty here at the McGrath Institute for Church Life, and I teach in the theology department. I'll be moderating the panel today. The way that this is going to go, I'll introduce all three of our speakers now. They will come up and give their papers sequentially, and then we'll have about 20 or so minutes for questions for the entire group at the end of the session. And we ask that if you have a question, because this is being recorded, for audio's sake, if you will go to the microphone there to ask your question instead of just staying at your seat, that would help us out. I'll give you a reminder at the end that that's how it goes. But if you can remember, write down your question and then go to the microphone, that would be great. So for our speakers, our first speaker is Richard Doerflinger, who's giving a talk titled Redesigning the Person, Genetic Enhancement and Two Views of Human Dignity. Richard is a public policy fellow with the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, an associate scholar with the Charlotte Lozier Institute, and an adjunct fellow in bioethics and public policy at the National Catholic Bioethics Center. He was formerly associate director of the Secretariat of Pro-Life Activities for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, where he worked for 36 years, preparing policy statements and congressional testimony on abortion, euthanasia, embryo research, and other medical moral issues. He is a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life. In April 2011, Mr. Doerflinger became the first recipient of the Evangelium Vitae Medal, awarded annually by the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. Our second speaker is James Mumford, who is giving a talk titled, What Environmentalists Have to Teach Transhumanists. James is a British author, scholar, and senior fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. Educated at Oxford and Yale, James's DPhil, A Defense of the Sanctity of Life of the New One or Unborn Child, was published by Oxford University Press as Ethics at the Beginning of Life in 2013. He is currently writing a book, Attacking Our Therapeutic Culture, based on his widely read New Atlantis essay of spring 2022, Therapy Beyond Good and Evil. And finally, our last speaker is Dillon Stull. He's giving a talk titled, What Clones, Organoids, and Chimeras teach us about organismal development and what it means for projects of human enhancement. Dillon is a physician in training in family medicine at Memorial Hospital in South Bend, Indiana. He's been a fellow in theology, medicine, and culture at Duke Divinity School, and a Paul Ramsey Fellow and junior scholar at the Center for Bioethics and Culture in California. During his time in medical school at Stanford, he was awarded a medical scholars grant to consider the moral meaning of new stem cell biotechnologies, such as organoids and chimeras, which he conducted under the mentorship of William Hurlbut as part of Stanford's Boundaries of Humanity project. So I'll welcome to the podium Richard Doerflinger.
With the advent of gene editing technique known as CRISPR, it has become much easier to propose deleting, adding, modifying genes in all kinds of creatures, including human beings. I will not go into the technical aspects of CRISPR because there is an expert on that here, and I don't understand them myself, except to note that if you say it loud enough, you'll always sound precocious. Clustered, regularly interspaced, short palindromic repeats. But, what I want to talk about is some relevant ethical distinctions and how they play out in different views of the human person. You could do somatic cell editing. That would be modifying genes in some parts of the developed human body or another individual organism, versus germline editing. If you edit genes in the sperm and or egg or the early embryo, that affects all of that individual's cells, including the future sex cells and all future descendants of that individual. There is also a distinction between therapy and enhancement, though many people would say it's very difficult to draw an exact line between those when you're trying to help people improve their health. Therapy, preventing or treating disease, versus enhancement, improving mental or physical abilities beyond the current healthy norm. You could put these on a sort of chart from green to red in terms of the degree of ethical concern that's been raised about them. Somatic cell therapy being the most widely accepted. Germline therapy being more open to questions because it has such permanent effects on the genome of the human beings. And enhancement, much more controversial overall, especially if you do germline therapy and have effects on the entire future of that person's descendants. So what does this have to do with the dignity of the person? Well, the UN issued in 1998 a Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights, saying that everyone has a right to respect for their dignity and for their rights regardless of their genetic characteristics, and that dignity makes it imperative not to reduce individuals to their genetic characteristics and to respect their uniqueness and diversity. It said that no research or research applications should prevail over respect for the human rights, fundamental freedoms, and human dignity of individuals or, where applicable, of groups of people. And it enjoined UNESCO to give advice to nations about identifying practices that could be contrary to human dignity, such as germline interventions. Notice that three-part distinction there: human rights, fundamental freedoms, and human dignity. They thought that those were three distinct things. Human dignity was also used sometimes all by itself, so it seemed to be the most comprehensive and the most fundamental of these. And I'll get back to why that's important in a bit. Then there was a UN Declaration on Human Cloning in 2005, calling on member states to prohibit all forms of human cloning because they're incompatible with human dignity and the protection of human life, and member states were called to prohibit the application of genetic engineering techniques that may be contrary to human dignity. So in cloning, of course, they felt we're talking about manufacturing people to order as copies of others with useful attributes. The person is valued for those attributes, otherwise you wouldn't be cloning them, you'd be reproducing in other ways. And that is bypassing the idea of the dignity and uniqueness of persons. So what does dignity mean? Well, it came from the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, proclaiming that recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Jacques Maritain has written, he was very involved in these debates in 1948, by the way. He records that someone was astonished and said to him that it was amazing that proponents of violently opposed ideologies agreed on a list of the draft of rights. And he said, yes, we agree on the rights, provided we are not asked why. With the why, the dispute begins. So one meaning, so what do you mean by dignity? You get the same reaction. Well, don't ask us about that. We can't quite define it. One meaning of the dignity of the human person, and this is one I'm going to raise questions about. It means that dignity arises from expressing and achieving one's freely chosen goals, becoming, quote, the author of one's own life. Ethicist John Harris uses that term. Steven Pinker says dignity is individual autonomy, which already departs from what the UN was saying, because there were fundamental freedoms, but there was human dignity as well, which might be the basis of our respect for freedom. And Robert Bellah, sociologist, and philosopher Charles Taylor have called it the worldview of expressive individualism. I am my dreams, my aspirations, my ability to exercise my will to remake myself. That includes the freedom to transcend one's given characteristics, potentially one's own nature. This is a very popular view among many scientists and secular ethicists. It tends to erase distinctions. Lee Silver, microbiologist and author of Remaking Eden, says the moral distinction between therapy and enhancement is imaginary. It's all enhancement because it's done to provide a child with an advantage of one kind or another she would not have had otherwise. And what's wrong with that? Germline enhancement is actually seen as a greater achievement for our self-designated visions of the good and a basis for ever greater improvements in generations to come. It could be freedom from one's human nature. Ethicist John Harris and also Nick Bostrom, author of Why I Want to Be a Posthuman When I Grow Up, endorsed the idea of creating a superior new species that does not even reproduce with the inferior Homo sapiens. Lee Silver talks of self-divinization. Post-human beings will find themselves face to face with their creator, perhaps seeing simply their own image in the mirror. Best-selling author Yuval Noah Harris in Homo Deus has talked about bioengineers, rather than waiting for the long, tedious process of natural selection to work its magic, will take the old sapiens body, intentionally rewrite its genetic code, do other manipulations, and thereby create new godlings who might be as different from sapiens as we are different from Homo erectus. He says the first cognitive revolution, the beginning of human self-awareness, gave us access to the intersubjective realm, turned us into rulers of the planet. The second cognitive revolution will give Homo Deus access to unimaginable new realms and make us lords of the galaxy. There are some paradoxes in this absolute autonomy. C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man pointed out that autonomous control of human evolution really means that a few imperfect people's control of the perfection of their experimental subjects and all future generations will make the rest of us subject to their autonomous power. It easily becomes freedom over and against others, the power of the strong over the weak, the power of the rich who can afford these enhancements over the poor. And that could lead to a sort of hard coercion, different, subclass of inferior human beings versus the superior, with policies that follow along that. And there's also the subtle power of accumulated free choices and societal expectations. From the film Gattaca, there is no law against people reproducing in the old-style way, but every parent who is planning to have a child is told, you want to give your child the best possible start. And very few people are able to resist that. Dr. Robert Edwards, who the co-developer of in vitro fertilization in humans, said soon it will be a sin of parents to have a child that carries the heavy burden of genetic disease. A while back, Iceland said that through prenatal diagnosis and abortion, it had virtually eliminated Down syndrome from the population. If you want to look at soft coercion, you might want to look at the contemporary debate about athletics and Title IX, which was supposed to make sure that universities and other institutions give women equal access to athletics, to sports. Ends up with biological males winning a lot of the tournaments. So what if the enhanced are the norm? And that's the land of Gattaca. The invalids, those who are not enhanced, or invalids, are a new underclass. They're called faith births, godchildren, because nobody but a religious fanatic would forego the enhancement. What if they're the exception? Dr. Julian Bashir, in the series Star Trek Deep Space Nine, season 5 episodes, he knows that he has been illegally genetically enhanced by his parents' decision. He calls himself a freak, a monster. His father assures him, "You're not less human than anyone else, maybe a bit more so." But he is deeply disturbed at this secret and the fact that his parents decided to do this. He says, "Everything but my name was altered in some way." He was a slow learner in first grade. He was physically awkward, had no good hand-eye coordination. Later, as a teenager, he actually changed his name from Jules to Julian to reflect the fact that he was a new person, a different person. He argues with his father about this, but his father says, "I'm your father, you can't talk to me that way." He says, "You used to be my father, now you're my architect." Jules Bashir died in that hospital because you couldn't live with the shame of having a son who didn't measure up. But I think it's fascinating in both these future worlds, both where the enhanced are in charge and where they actually have to hide it because they are the exception and it's not legal. There's conflict, division between the genetic haves and have-nots, and a certain amount of self-loathing even among the enhanced. Because in Gattaca, the man who was not genetically enhanced purchases the identity of someone who was enhanced, but is now in a wheelchair. He's in a wheelchair because he threw himself in front of traffic to commit suicide because, despite his enhancements, he never got more than a silver medal in his favorite sport. He fell short of perfection. So if we want to be seeing another definition of human dignity, we have another international institution besides the UN. Yes, that's St. Peter's. And I'm not saying the Catholic Church has some things to say about this. Just because we're at Notre Dame, it turns out there was a key Catholic role in the UN's documents on human dignity. Jacques Maritain, who I've mentioned, was ambassador to UNESCO and is seen as the godfather of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Canadian attorney and diplomat John Humphrey, who helped with the drafting, he said that what we'd produced was dominated by Catholics and communists, with the latter a poor second. In his diary, he said that what they'd managed to do was Christian morality without the Tommy rot. Pope John XXIII in Pacem in Terris praised the UN Declaration and hoped that declarations like this would recognize the dignity of human persons, which is universal, inviolable, and inalienable. The Vatican's instruction on respect for human life in its origin and dignity of procreation talked about gene editing that is not therapeutic and said those manipulations are contrary to the personal dignity of the human being and his or her integrity and identity. Every person must be respected for himself. In this consists the dignity and right of every human being from his or her beginning. In a longer reflection, Pope John Paul II, speaking to the World Medical Association, talked again about the person's innate dignity and how to reconcile the drive for genetic enhancement with that. He said, if you're reducing life to an object, you're treating the person in terms of criteria not founded on the integral reality of the human person, at the risk of infringing on his dignity. Each person, in his absolutely unique singularity, is constituted not only by his spirit, and I would say, in response to the other vision of the human person, not only by his will, but by his body as well. To respect the dignity of man amounts to safeguarding this identity of the man, corpore et anima unus, one in soul and body. And that's where the criteria lie for determining the ethics of this. He did endorse the idea of somatic therapies, when medicine intervenes not to modify nature, but to favor its development according to its own essence, that of the creation, that intended by God. And that passage is quoted also by Pope Francis in Laudato Si on the environment. And finally, Samaritas Bonus from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, the Good Samaritan. Each person's vulnerability is encoded in our nature as a unity of body and soul. We are materially and temporally finite, yet we have a longing for the infinite and a destiny that is eternal, body and soul together. So this leads to a richer meaning of dignity. It's not reducible to particular rights or freedoms. It's equal in all humans, grounding equal and inherent rights. It's due to this unique composite nature of human beings, body and soul, the given and the transcendent. Here, Gilbert Meilander has a wonderful reflection called Neither Beast Nor God. And it's not perfection. It's a call to recognize our flaws and address them through our bonds of interdependency with others who complement us. Here, see Alistair McIntyre, Dependent Rational Animals, which is a secular version of what I'm talking about when I talk about bodies and souls. Carter Sneed, who runs the center, in his book, What It Means to Be Human, fleshes this out further. We have to remember the body as an integral aspect of the human person, not a mere tool of the will. The vulnerability, mutual dependence, and finitude that result from our individual and shared lives as embodied beings is what ensures respect for our common dignity, which is the intrinsic equal worth of all human beings who are alike in vulnerability, neediness, and our natural limits. So that view of human dignity does not demand quietism or opposition in the face of genetic defects or the need for medical advance. It does provide a check on unlimited redefining and refashioning of ourselves and others. It's a sense of humility before the givenness, or to a religious believer, the gift of our shared humanity, which we do not so much invent as discover. Michael Sandel, who is not a religious believer, has a very interesting secular treatment of this in his book, The Case Against Perfection. So I have a final question for those who would take the personal autonomy model of human dignity. If we can't agree, if we're not quite sure what the definition is of what it means to be human, or in what is good about being human, how can we, imperfect humans with imperfect knowledge and will, know what a better human would be, much less what it would be to be better than human? Questions like that go beyond the realm of science. Scientists alone cannot answer them. They're directed to all of us, and our answers may help determine the human, or perhaps the post-human, future. Thank you.
Good morning. I don't have a PowerPoint. We don't really do PowerPoints in the UK. It's great to be here. It's always great to have a chance, the free speech that I'm enjoying in America, because it's rather a woeful situation in the UK. You're not allowed to pray outside of abortion clinics anymore. I don't know if you read that. So people have been arrested for the first time since, I guess, the Reformation for that. We won't go into, I'm an Anglican, so we won't go into Reformation, but basically the first time for a long time that what's going on inside your head, you have to divulge to the police. And so I'm just going to go wild this morning because I enjoy this free speech moment. The advantage, I was saying to my colleagues that it's going to be, the advantage of having written a book that no one's read is that you can come to conferences like this and plagiarize yourself without anyone knowing. So that's what I'm going to do this morning. I wrote a book in the pandemic called Vexed, which my mother bought a lot of copies of. And this is one of the chapters of, this is taken from one of those chapters. The book is about political tribalism and how that warps how we think about live rail moral questions. So this talks about what might the environmentalist left have to teach libertarian transhumanists, particularly about human enhancement of various kinds. Concern for the environment was not initially high on the agenda of the burgeoning ranks of the young radicals of the 1960s. 2 years after its founding, in 1962, the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, published its seminal Port Huron statement. Of burning concern to them, the country's military-industrial complex, the racial bigotry that blighted society, labor relations, the legacy of colonialism, the threat of nuclear annihilation. In dozens of pages, the environment received only a single sentence, a vague reference to the threat of overpopulation. Well, there were a few activists who were convinced that this could change. 5 years after the Port Huron statement, in September 1969, a Democratic senator from Wisconsin, Gaylord Nelson, said this: "I'm convinced that the same..." Oh, am I too near that? Is that why it's doing that? Does anyone know? Am I too near? Okay. "I'm convinced that the same concern the youth of this nation took in changing this nation's priorities on the war in Vietnam and on civil rights can be shown for the problem of the environment." A year later, wielding the most recent scientific revelations about environmental degradation and tapping into the left's predisposition to question the effects of industrial capitalism, Nelson pulled off one of the largest mass protests in US history at that time. Oh, that's not me, is it? No, that would be bad form. Earth Day 1970 saw 20 million Americans take to the streets to protest against pollution and to raise environmental issues to public consciousness. But what was the value to which the leaders of the nascent movement appealed? How did they rally the counterculture to this new cause, to environmentalism? Well, as the coordinator of the Earth Day put it, Barry Hayes, looking back, he said, "We hoped it would lead to a new kind of ideology, a new value system based on ecology and a reverence for life." Since then, reverence has remained the foundational principle for environmentalists across the world, from local wildlife conservationist chapters to radical ecotage operatives to international bodies. The historic Earth Charter of 1990 ended with these words: "Let ours be a time remembered for the awakening of a new reverence for life." Now, what does reverence mean? Here's a dictionary definition. It's a noun. A feeling or attitude of deep respect tinged with awe and veneration. For environmentalists, reverence is more than simply aesthetic receptivity. Reverence for nature is the posture or attitude demanded by our situation, by the fact that our existence depends on the equilibrium and stability of the biosphere. We are, after all, not astronauts who have fitted out the place for habitation. Rather, we exist on a planet that produced vitality before we arrived on the scene. The intricacy of the natural order, the web of interactions between species and between species in the physical environment. We do not just look upon this beautiful tapestry as something made by someone else, which it might be wrong to violate. No, this tapestry is the condition for our existence. What we encounter in nature is greater than us, which would elicit a certain humility, but what we are dependent on this greatness, which should elicit a certain gratitude or a certain reverence. Now, what forms of treating nature does the attitude of reverence permit, prescribe, and require? Does it rule out any encroachment whatsoever? I mean, does not our survival depend on our not leaving nature as we found it? You don't have to be exposed to the elements in South Bend for too long to acknowledge that if we had not changed our habitat in all manner of ways, we simply would not have made it as a species. We had to encroach upon nature. But it's here that the concept of cultivation is important. Cultivation names a symbiosis, an ability to act in concert with nature. The earliest farmers in the Levant conscripted the forces of natural selection to grow the plants they wanted. They drew on organic processes to select crops, realizing potentialities latent in nature. For 10,000 years, human beings have altered their environments by way of agriculture, but they live within the regenerative capacity of the biosphere. So cultivation, then, names a form of engagement with the natural world which is reverent, because it entails the acceptance of limits. Of course, completely different from cultivation is the picture of mastery, and you'll be familiar with the Baconian mastery mindset. In the 20th century, this was applied to the environment by thinkers like Herbert Marcuse, who, is it Marcuse? I'm a reader rather than a speaker, forgive me, who assailed the mastery mindset. Preceding the development of technology, he observed, is a projection of nature as the stuff of control and organization, and the reconception of the earth as merely raw material for human purposes, to be utilized and then disposed of. And so you could think of an example as the monocultures in agriculture and the cost of that, or you could think of global warming and the fact that our attempts at mastery have been extraordinary but also unsuccessful. As David Wallace Wells writes in The Uninhabitable Earth, there was no final conquest, no dominion established. In fact, the opposite with global warming. We have unwittingly claimed ownership of a system beyond our ability to control or tame in any doable way. Now, the same year that the Earth Charter was published, 1990, there was another founding text published for the transhumanist movement. In his extraordinary letter to Mother Nature, Max More issues a major complaint. He says this: "You, Mother Nature, have in many ways done a poor job with the human constitution." And then he says it's time to amend it. And then he gives a series of amendments. 1, we will no longer tolerate the tyranny of aging and death. And so we have to have all these enhancements to deal with that. I'm skipping a little bit here. 2, we will expand our perceptual range through biotechnological and computational means. We seek to exceed the perceptual abilities of any other creature. 3, we will improve on our neural organization and capacity and get better memories. 5, and then you skip the Amendment 5, he says we should no longer be a slave to our genes. We'll fix defects. Not content with that, he says, we will seek complete choice of our bodily form, so morphological freedom and function, refining and augmenting our physical and intellectual abilities beyond those of any human in history. And finally, 6, we will cautiously yet boldly reshape our motivational patterns and emotional responses. So the first thing to note about Max More's letter to Mother Nature is this sense of dissatisfaction, not being content with the human condition. And our capacities as they are simply not good enough for him. The deliveries of evolution do not suffice. Instead, they require radical enhancement for everyone, to bring everyone together to the optimally functioning human being, to that level, and to exceed every other creature. So what we see then, basically, is that if in the Baconian view, nature is construed as merely raw material to be used by human beings as natural resources to be utilized, now we are the ones being construed as raw material. More's letter explicitly employs the language of mastery. For Bacon, the hope for invention or technology is that through it people can finally subject the world to their wills. For More, the hope for invention, for genetic alteration, cellular manipulation, synthetic organs, is to subject ourselves to our will, to take our own evolution in hand, to take charge of our development. And therefore, if mastery is the posture towards nature which is the opposite of reverence, Mr. More's letter betrays a lack of reverence for human nature, for the given state that we're found in. He even says, transhumanists regard human nature not as an end in itself, having no claim on our allegiance. So let me move to finish by talking about, move to finish is vague, land the plane. How long have I got left? I'm slightly editing on the hoof. There's some really good stuff left. Oh, great. So I'll slow down now. I might go back. No, I won't. So I want to proceed by talking about certain enhancements that fail to revere human nature and how, if there is a connection between our nature and our good, some enhancements threaten our good. That's the argument that I'm going to present to you. The first species of enhancement, or forms of enhancement I'll mention, seek to do away with the body. The second enhancements upset the mind. And the third are enhancements that numb the heart. So we've got the body, the mind, and the heart. So first, the body. One historic enthusiast for the internet, John Perry Barlow, once wrote of the electronic frontier that it is a world which is both everywhere and nowhere, but it is not where bodies live. Evidence of Barlow's how prophetic it was, what he was saying, is our talk today of living online. Yet for transhumanists, this is only the beginning. The promise of brain-machine interfaces is to realize Barlow's vision fully. Neuralase technology, implanting electrodes into the brain for direct computing capabilities, an iteration of which is already in use for patients with brain injuries, will, we are told, eventually give us the power literally to plug ourselves into the internet to be caught up in the World Wide Web. Well, what are we to make of this? Following Iris Murdoch and Simone Weil, the writer Matthew Crawford has written compellingly about the importance of attention, attuning ourselves to our environment, and the importance of attention for a well-lived life. He does this in his book, The World Outside Your Head. And as Crawford observes, attention presupposes embodiment. The reality is that we think through our bodies. First, because cognition, far more than we care to admit, depends on our ability to move around an object and see what is the same or different about it from various perspectives. And what we do is central to how we see. And secondly, attention presupposes embodiment because to attend to something is to select. To pick out one item from the flux of things is by definition to screen off others. And the principle of selection is determined by our situatedness. Where we are physically located offers a default reason to attend to a certain object or person we encounter. They're there. And those phenomena which are within reach and to hand, to use Heideggerian language, take priority by the sheer virtue of this co-presence. Well, in a life lived virtually, Crawford writes, this removes us from whatever situation we inhabit directly, eradicating physical co-presence and making us as near or as far as from things and people as we choose. How then do we select what to pay attention to in the first place? There is no longer a default answer given by our actual frame of reference. Crawford speaks of a uniform distancelessness. The introduction of brain-machine interfaces or even whole brain emulation in its ambition to double down on virtual reality will entrench these pathologies. By transcending the body even more radically, we will further diminish the human. So that's the first point, the body. The second is the dismissal of the body. The second point is the upsetting of the mind. Transhumanists propose enhancements which upset the mind. Now, they imagine various routes towards superintelligence, like psychopharmacology, smart drugs for everyone, but that is their proposal. But they also, of course, and this was as was mentioned in the previous talk, transhumanists have long dreamt of genetic manipulation as a means towards superintelligence. As genome-wide trait analysis becomes more sophisticated and epigenetic factors become better understood, parents might be able to select for strongly heritable traits such as IQ at embryo stage, or even make their embryos to order via the synthesizing of genomes, designing a child with a specific combination of their genetic inputs. What would it be like if this future were brought into being? We've heard about some of the societal conflict that we could imagine and anticipate. But at the level of the individual, what would cognitive enhancement portend? Well, we can get a grip on this question by asking first, what exactly is it that transhumanists propose to enhance? Intelligence, we're told, but what is intelligence? What kind of intelligence? And the more you read the transhumanists, the more striking appears the reduction of intelligence to computation or calculative rationality, the ability to retrieve, sift, and apply information. But what about all the other more Platonic forms of intelligence? Does calculative rationality really exhaust the domain of reason? What is the effect of reducing intelligence to computation? Now recall what we said about the meaning of reverence. For environmentalists, what demands reverence is the equilibrium that makes our terrestrial life possible. Taking a holistic view allows us to identify the extraordinary alignment of factors that allow this world to be our home. And we are only too aware of what happens when this balance is upset. Well, in the same way, if the candidate for enhancement is only one form of intelligence, what we have to fear, I want to argue, is that the exaggeration or accentuation of calculative rationality, this one form of intelligence, will upset the given balance between different forms of intelligence. Calculative rationality, as Nick Bostrom is happy to concede, is typically understood as means-end reasoning. If instrumental reasoning, or means-end reasoning, is enhanced, we are told that executing a given task will become radically quicker and more efficient. But that begs the question of how one decides which ends to choose to pursue in the first place, and that requires a different form of intelligence, of wisdom. The improvement of concentration will not necessarily increase wisdom. We have reason to fear that one form of intelligence would eclipse another, and so enhancements might upset the mind. And finally, the enhancements transhumanists propose would numb the heart. Vulnerability derives from the Latin word for wound, vulnus. We are woundable creatures. My friend betrays my trust. I'm left exposed by former intimacy. My partner knows me well enough to hit where it hurts with her or his words. And our sensitivity concusses us. How much more could we accomplish if we were thick-skinned, we think to ourselves. Yet while our agency is impaired by our vulnerability, we are nevertheless rightly suspicious of the dictum, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Because if a person is and remains impervious to emotion, we sense something is up. We wonder why. We wonder what's wrong. We look to excavate what it is in their past that makes them so stoic and so dysfunctional. Consider grief. The openness to another required for love necessarily makes one vulnerable to heartbreak. Someone who is unaffected, who remains too stoical or moves on quickly, whose mood stabilizes straight away, we would either question the person or we would question the depth of their love. But if we are given to love and to be loved, if that comes with the territory of living a flourishing human life, then we must say that vulnerability does too. Therefore, given the indispensable place of vulnerability, it is particularly important to question another form of alteration that transhumanists propose, mood enhancements. Here's a quote from the film that became Blade Runner, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. A merry little surge of electricity piped by automatic alarm from the mood organ beside his bed awakened Rick Deckard. I think that's the first line. The amusing scene which ensues sees Deckard and his wife discussing the various moods they wish to induce in themselves by recourse to these mood organs. But the spectre of such sophisticated mood control is haunting because we are so averse to the kind of vulnerability which we saw makes love possible. How irresistible would prove the instinct to diminish the debilitating rawness we feel in the roller coaster of relationships? How tempting would it be to harden our hearts? And so my conclusion, having thought about how we dismiss the body, how enhancements would dismiss the body, upset the mind, and numb the heart, is that revering human nature, the lesson that we get from the environmentalists, that revering human nature means refusing the radical enhancements, and that's what we libertarian transhumanism has to learn from left-wing environmentalism. Thank you. Is that over time?
So I based this talk on a chapter that I co-authored with Dr. William Hurlbut here. It was published a few months ago in this Rutledge handbook. So if you find anything beautiful in this talk, he probably said it. If you find any errors, please forgive me. So brilliant advancements in bioengineering suggest that attempts to alter the human form in fundamental ways may be within reach. Gene editing is commonplace in the laboratory, and so is the transformation of cells from one stage to another. Stem cells are being modified, assembled, and transplanted into a whole host of contexts, including the embryos of other species and even human beings. As the field of developmental biology unlocks the secrets of our biological constitution, should we expect medical technology to give us specialized forms of human life, or perhaps to facilitate our evolutionary progress, if our species is indeed a way station toward further refinement of activity, structure, or purpose, as projects of human enhancement suggest? This talk will begin with a survey of the last 3 decades of experiments with human stem cells, including the production of clones, organoids, and chimeras, and stem cell-based embryo models. I will highlight several major biological principles evident from these experiments, and drawing on these principles, I will then comment on the nature of the human form and reflect on the biological feasibility of projects attempting to enhance, modify, or refine the human form in a radical way. What clones have taught us about genes? In 1996, the world saw the birth of the first successfully cloned mammal, Dolly the sheep. This extraordinary feat was accomplished by a technique known as somatic cell nuclear transfer. The DNA-containing nucleus was removed from a sheep egg and replaced with the nucleus of an adult body cell, a somatic cell from a different sheep. The creation of cloned embryos through this technique overturned the widely held belief that mature cells committed to more specialized states could not revert to the less differentiated multipotent states seen in embryonic development. But in the cloning of Dolly, the genetic material derived from an adult cell was reprogrammed, in this case by its new intracellular context, to serve the essential functions of the developing embryo. Dolly gave us 2 important revisions in our understanding of development. First, the flexible, context-dependent nature of gene expression and cell fates, and relatedly, a recognition that DNA is not the master molecule, but is in dynamic interrelation with factors in the cytoplasm, the cellular contents outside the nucleus, that influence gene expression. In the memorable words of biologist Stephen Rose, correcting the errors of what has been called DNA essentialism, there is no nuclear boardroom, but a wider coordinated molecular democracy. Cell behavior depends not only on gene content, but also gene packaging, and this packaging is guided, maintained, and refashioned by the cellular context surrounding the DNA-containing nucleus. Ultimately, in multicellular organisms, intercellular signals and extrinsic inputs tracing all the way up to high-order mental operations also influence the cellular microenvironment and gene expression. Genes also interfere and interface with one another, both in their packaging and in the protein products they release into the cytoplasmic milieu. The net result is a web of molecular interactions of unimaginable complexity. As a result, most biological traits are specified by many genes, and most genes contribute to many different traits. This is vividly and tragically evident in the way most single-gene genetic disorders affect numerous aspects of a patient's life. And genetic diseases generally manifest as syndromes with a constellation of diverse disorders. These reflect the many roles with complex interactions that a given gene may play. So the conditions we would care most about, such as intelligence, beauty, longevity, result from interaction among many genes, sometimes hundreds or even thousands, and would not be easy to alter for purposes of enhancement. What organoids have taught us about cells and tissues. 10 years after Dolly, the Japanese scientist Shinya Yamanaka demonstrated that adult body cells could be reprogrammed to an embryonic-like state by causing them to temporarily express 4 key protein products. He called these induced pluripotent stem cells. With this ethical alternative to embryonic stem cells, research using pluripotent stem cells has since exploded. Our increasing facility with stem cells and culture media has led, among other things, to the burgeoning new arena of organoid research. Organoids are in vitro, 3-dimensional cell cultures resembling bodily tissue structures. Given the proper environment, stem cells or tissue-specific progenitor cells proliferate and assemble themselves into multicellular structures that recapitulate many aspects of in vivo physiology. they manifest the remarkable capacity for autopoiesis that is inherent to certain cells. Organoid systems have been created for a wide range of tissues and visceral organs, including lung, liver, kidney, and intestine, and many of these retain functional properties such as gas exchange, filtration, and peristalsis. And the brain is no exception. In vitro human-derived cells, coaxed along a neural trajectory, exhibit specific cell types and regional structures as diverse as forebrain, striatum, retina, thalamus, and spinal cord. Technical advances improving culture conditions have allowed us to observe natural developmental properties such as cellular migration, circuit formation, electrical activity, and the timeline of all these processes in these neural organoids. They can even be structurally paired with one another or with other cell or tissue types to produce assembloids, such as in this model, which joins cerebral, spinal, and muscular tissue. Let's see if I can get this video to play. It's not playing. In this model, you'll see these muscle cells, if this video were to play, they even twitch because of the spontaneous electrical activity in the cerebral organoids transmitted by the spinal cord neurons. Yet the limitations of organoids are just as revealing as their capabilities. While organoids are functional at the cellular level, none can yet perform the macro functions proper to their respective organs. At this point, in vitro organoid productions are very small, less than 4 millimeters, and generally lack natural vascularization, innervation, and immune cell infiltration. In living organisms, on the other hand, tissue types are interwoven with one another, as many specialized developmental programs unfold simultaneously using subtle cues. Cellular activity is responsive to ion gradients, pH, waste and nutrients, hormones, chemical signals from surrounding cells and tissues, electrical signals, and even mechanical stresses such as stretch, resistance, or shearing, and many other things. Some of these conditions can be simulated by microfluidic devices that expose organoids to fluid or airflow, variegated culture media, specific spatial positions, and mechanical perturbations. A microfluidic system, such as the one depicted here, allows organoids of various tissue types to be placed up or downstream one another for molecular crosstalk between them. This particular one was used to create a reproductive organoid system with interconnected modules of ovarian, fallopian tube, cervical, uterine, and hepatic tissues that successfully recapitulated the ovulatory and corresponding hormonal features of the 28-day menstrual cycle. Nevertheless, even the most complex organoid models to date pale in comparison to the structural and functional complexity made possible in the harmonious interplay within the whole organism. Organoids show us that developmental programs may be delegated and innate to specific cells or tissues, but remain highly interdependent in their unfolding maturation. What chimeras have taught us about organisms and species? One way to study stem cell activity within a whole body while avoiding the use of embryos is to place stem cells into the bodies of non-human organisms. The combination of cells or tissues from at least 2 distinct organisms is called a chimera, and scientists have produced many kinds of chimeras, including at embryonic stages. One common technique is to inject pluripotent stem cells from one organism into the blastocyst, a very early pre-implantation embryo of another organism. And yes, these images are embryonic human monkey chimeras. 2 important observations have cropped up in experiments with interspecies chimeras. First, there are what the literature calls interspecies barriers to cellular compatibility. Cells compete for survival and signaling dominance, develop on different timescales, play different roles, exist in different states of potentiality, utilize different molecular and physical signals, etc. So for these reasons, it's been difficult to achieve significant levels of chimerism between all but the most closely related species, such as mice and rats. Human-animal chimeras have generally not survived past early embryonic stages. Second, experiments suggest a graft-host paradigm of body plan dominance. In a mouse-rat chimerism experiment, a rat pancreas was grown inside of a mouse, meaning it was composed almost entirely of rat cells. yet the pancreas was still mouse-sized and functional in the mouse's body. The inverse experiment has also been done with a functional rat-sized mouse-derived pancreas developed in a rat's body. In a particularly striking case, scientists produced a mouse genetically incapable of developing its own gallbladder and injected rat stem cells into it. The chimera grew a mouse-sized gallbladder composed entirely of rat cells, even though rats do not even have gallbladders. Apparently, the cellular microenvironment created by the mouse's developing body influenced the rat stem cells to unlock gallbladder developmental program that is normally suppressed in rat development. The graft-host paradigm holds true at the microscopic level as well. Human stem cells inserted into early-stage cynomolgus monkey embryos began to act more like monkey cells than human cells in their gene expression. These studies suggest that organismic organization tends toward the stable somatic configurations that have been established through the long continuity of the evolutionary process. Whether because of cell number or type or role, viable chimeric animals have tended to follow a graft-host paradigm of body plan dominance, in which the engrafted donor cells must conform, emphasis on form, to the basic typology of the host embryo species, or else die. So chimeric experiments not only reveal biological barriers to integrating cells from different species, but a propensity for cells, both native and donor, to go on organizing according to pre-established blueprints of the body, tried and true systems of structural and functional coherence that manifest themselves in specific forms of life. Even where latent developmental programs exist, as in the rat cells that gave rise to a gallbladder, such programs are only meaningful insofar as there is a coherent pattern of development in which they can cooperate. Let's talk now about stem cell-based embryo models, or embryoids, which takes us to more recent news. And if you've been thinking that this talk can't get any weirder, I'm sorry to say that you're mistaken. Given the technical difficulty of interspecies experiments, not to mention the problem of extrapolating such data to the human case alone, some have proposed the use of stem cell-based embryo models for the ethical study of human embryonic development. This summer, at least 4 different research groups around the world announced that they had produced biological models of post-implantation human embryos with some uncanny resemblances to true embryos. These embryonic simulacra, called embryoids by some, were produced by taking a few crucial types of stem cells and mixing them together. This diagram depicts the timing for mouse embryoids, but the concept is similar. These cell clumps demonstrate a remarkable ability to self-organize, cooperating coherently enough to undergo some of the key developmental transitions in the second week of human embryonic life, a reality sparking much discussion in this October's issue of Nature. The clusters of cells self-organized into structures mimicking blastocysts, the hollow spherical stage of embryos from about 5 to 12 days of age, and subsequently underwent gastrulation, the self-folding process occurring at 12 to 14 days post-fertilization that follows directly after the blastocyst stage. And they even formed rudimentary, though imperfect, primordia of the brain and other organs. This shows the similarity between the embryoid and the natural embryo in experiments with mice, which can be cultured for relatively longer periods, but similar progress can be expected with the human embryoids. As embryoids are growing increasingly similar to true embryos, mainstream secular scientists and bioethicists are asking whether human embryo research restrictions ought to apply to them. Based on the pieces I've seen on the issue, many of them are grounding their arguments about embryoid ontology in terms of the developmental potential that they display or lack. I find that notable, and I wonder where I've heard arguments like that before. But how is this magic working? Throw a few embryonic stem cells into a cluster and they might become a true embryo? Where is their unifying principle coming from? Organismic life requires integrity and unity of function. This normally begins at the level of a single cell when a new organism is conceived. Development then unfolds as the whole precedes and produces the parts. Is it possible that a product assembled at the multicellular stage could achieve the degree of integrated function requisite for organismic existence? My hypothesis is that yes, it is possible that with further refinement of laboratory techniques, embryoids, at least this kind, could become integrated organisms because there's a biological precedent to this. In human beings, twins can arise from similar multicellular clusters, though probably a bit more organized than these clusters. A disruption in an 8 to 12-day-old embryo can displace a portion of its inner cell mass. The embryonic stem cells at this stage of development retain such a remarkable plasticity, reorganizing, adapting, and cooperating, that the process can sometimes salvage both fragments of the inner cell mass. And there we have twins. But regarding embryoids, should we attempt to assemble them much further beyond the 2-week mark, the degree of organizational complexity becomes such that achieving integration in a laboratory assembled multicellular organism will be exceedingly difficult, if not nearly impossible, to coordinate. I want to close by summarizing the central biological principle we've been exploring through these experimental observations, the principle of organismic integration, and what it implies for projects of human enhancement. A living being has an inherent principle of organic unity in its organization and operation. Development, from its beginnings in a single-cell embryo, the zygote, as well as during all future phases of an organism's existence, involves a coherent coordination of interdependent parts and processes subordinated to one another for the good of the whole. As the very term implies, an organism is an integrated, self-developing, and self-maintaining unity under the governance of an immanent plan. It is this overarching harmony of the whole, its dynamic balance of being, that exerts a downward causation that binds and balances the parts into a patterned process of integrated growth and development. For a developing embryo, with its inherent potency and activated drive toward the mature form, this means that the whole, as the unified organismal principle of life, precedes and produces the parts. The interwoven nature of the intra and intercellular processes we have discussed means that biological life has a tendency towards certain living forms, stable patterns refined through the long history of evolution and replicated many times over in embryonic development. The diverse but finite, though many, forms in the biological world represent the series of stable patterns that work for living things. In the case of humans, who stand out in the biological world with our unique openness to comprehension and creativity, we must be careful not to tinker too quickly with the fragile frame of our freedom. The biological paradigm sketched thus far explains why it is difficult to introduce radical changes into living systems, such as the human body. The dynamic, interconnected way in which living bodies encode and express organismic adaptations means that any change to a part impacts the rest of the system in some way, to greater or lesser degrees. Totally novel characteristics in a part may endanger the stability and harmonious function of the whole. Most of our attempts at enhancement will actually result in destabilization, as James also referenced. So-called projects of human enhancement, therefore, are better framed within the paradigm of sacrifice than of progress. Whether and how we determine which forms of bodily sacrifice might be acceptable is the subject of another talk, but the more permanent and the more radical the attempted change, the less likely to be compatible with human flourishing. Not only the biological viability and functionality, but the psycho-spiritual integrity and relational life of the person. This raises some key questions that are yet to be fully unpacked. I'll just read the first set of them here. Is the current human species simply a stepping stone toward a fuller and more flourishing human form? If so, are there unrecognized ongoing natural evolutionary processes at work reshaping our species? Or is it human destiny, as the transhumanists believe, to determine the human future by the application of our biotechnology? Thank you.
So friends, we have some time for questions. We asked if you're going to ask a question, just ask it there at the microphone for audio's sake. And then our presenters have a microphone up here, and I ask you guys to speak into the microphone. Just pass it back and forth if you don't mind.
Hi, I'm Tom Harmon from the University of St. Thomas in Houston. I guess my questions for the whole panel. I was really taken by by two of your presentations talking about this sacrifice, and which seems to be based on some kind of balance of faculties or biology. But that's actually my question. Is I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that. What provides for the balance, and what provides for the, I guess, corresponding disenhancement to with the attempted enhancement? So, hope that was clear enough.
So as Josh mentioned in my introduction, I'm a physician here in town at Memorial Hospital. And one thing that we're always dealing with in medicine is the possibility of disrupting the natural organismic balance that we see. Anything we prescribe can have side effects. And as to where that balance comes from, I think a lot of it arises out of our evolutionary context, that somehow through these multifactorial processes, our form has been harmonized in a way that reverberates in the proper ways with our surroundings. And so I think if we pretend that we know too much about how that balance works, then by accentuating certain aspects of our physiology, we throw off aspects of structure, function. There's a lot more that I could say about that. That's the short answer.
Though I didn't use the word sacrifice, I think you can describe the balance very much in secular terms as the unity of a dependent body, which depends on others in one's society for survival and flourishing, and the openness to the transcendent, self-awareness and awareness of a broader world and a cosmos that, in religious terms, I would talk about the soul. And tinkering with one or the other parts of that, in philosophical terms, poses enormous challenges and problems. I'm very grateful to Dillon Stull for giving a kind of biological scientific basis for that concern, because we've been talking in terms of philosophy and that our aspirations for the human person in society. And he's saying there's a very basic biological set of factors at work that help to ground that in the idea of the integrated functioning of an organism. So I'm grateful for that.
Hi guys, thanks for the talk. My question's aimed more at my fellow European James. One, it's great to have free speech, it's brilliant. I wish we had that at home, unfortunately not as much anyway. My question is about the environmentalist aspect of looking at transhumanism. If we want to accept, early human manipulation of our environment, and we want to use that sort of argument, do we run the risk of saying that organic, bioengineering is somehow okay? So I'm thinking more kind of natural style eugenics. Is that something we run the risk of? Can we address that using the framework that you have, or do we need to look elsewhere to try and bring in different principles that would say this is problematic, we can't do that? Thank you very much, guys.
That's great question. I didn't have in the chapter in the book. I sort of have a whole section on that question because I did beg the question this morning. I think what I was trying to say about cultivation in the environmental part of the talk grounds a distinction between therapy and enhancement that I'm committed to, and the fact that there is a sort of fidelity to human form that means that we're working like the farmers in the Levant conscripted the forces of natural selection, but there was a line between mastery and cultivation. In the same way, human form, means that what we're trying to do is basically reparative, and is limited and has a sense of the limits, and so there's a distinction to be made between mastery and cultivation or therapy in the therapeutic as opposed to enhancement, and so that's the sort of, yeah, I can't expand on it more now, but that's exactly why I introduced the sense of this cultivation as a form of reverence, which is agential. Yeah, good question, though.
Carter Sneed, Notre Dame. Dillon, I have a question for you. So, involving embryoids. So, in the early 2000s, when there were debates were unfolding on embryonic stem cell research and the moral and ontological status of the embryo that Richard and Bill and others participated in, there was a distinction frequently drawn between those who would defend the intrinsic equal moral status of the embryo and those who would argue in favor of using and destroying embryos for research purposes. And the argument was something like this: like, an embryo is an organism, a stem cell is not an organism. It was a kind of parts and wholes sort of argument, and people like Lee Silver and others would make the argument, well, an embryonic stem cell is an organism, because if you do tetraploid complementation, or even if you do somatic cell nuclear transfer, the cells themselves, the nuclear DNA that you use in somatic cell nuclear transfer, is itself an organism, because it becomes an organism if you manipulate it in a particular way, the likes of which you described, right? Situating it in a particular kind of environment where gene expression happens in different ways, and curating the emergence of an organism. In your talk, you talked about pluripotent cells being coaxed or used to create these models, or artificial embryos, embryoids, however you want to describe it. How did those developments affect the debate versus that I mentioned a moment ago, the distinction between organism, embryos, versus stem cells, not organisms? Those are parts and not wholes. Are the techniques of creating embryoids the same, or at least analogous, to somatic cell nuclear transfer, in the way that what you're doing is manipulating parts in a way that engenders an organism? The parts themselves are not organisms. How would you react to that?
I would agree with that wholeheartedly, and my intention is not to claim that pluripotent stem cells are themselves organisms. It takes me back to an article that I read from that era of debate, sort of facetious article that every sperm is sacred. I think it comes from a Monty Python movie that I haven't seen. Given the nature of somatic cell nuclear transfer, and also these Yamanaka factors that can produce induced pluripotent stem cells, if you're going to start saying that the nucleus of every cell is manifesting the same potential as an integrated organism that's actively progressing along that developmental trajectory already, there's no cell in the biological world that would be excluded from that. So we're not going to say every sperm is sacred and every pluripotent stem cell is sacred, but exactly as you're saying, I think it's this process, bringing them together in an integrated way, that opens the possibility of them functioning together. And if they do demonstrate the ability to harmonize together in a way that mimics embryos, then I think we have to entertain the possibility that we've just made an embryo. But like I pointed out, because of the twinning biological precedent, I think that's really the main thing that scientists have stumbled upon, that's opening the possibility that these things actually work. Because I think it's a very unique window and unique types of cells that they've figured out to assemble in that way.
Friends, I'm sorry that our time is drawn to a close. And just one more question? Okay, let's do one more question.
You probably shouldn't give me the floor when we're out of time, but I want to ask a question that is sort of at the intersection between these papers, but is something that seems to me like a not yet filled out space. And so that is around sort of definition and distinction. So Rich, you talked about human dignity and the kind of definitional imperative of you know, that where the concept tethers the you know, that where judgments about what should or shouldn't be done are tethered to a concept. Dillon, you talked about it just in your answer just now, the parts and wholes distinction, the integration and disintegration, and James, the cultivation distinction as a sort of normative distinction and an ontological distinction. I mean, both in all of these cases, this sort of definitional distinction is constitutive in a sense. But in each of these domains, there are forms of experimentation that are happening, in which the drawing of boundaries and the undrawing of boundaries is playing out through the practices that all three of you are interrogating. And so, James, as I was listening to you, I was thinking about the writings of the social theorist Zygmunt Bauman, who his reading of the Holocaust, I think, is one of the most interesting and provocative. You know, he says that it was an expression of a gardening instinct, a desire to order, not by mastering life, but by cultivating life in the appropriate sorts of ways, a perversion of a sort of sense of right order that manifests itself as a horror. And, you know, in a sense, Dillon, it seems to me the kind of biology that you're looking at has shifted from the project of a kind of mastery that dismantles into its constitutive parts to a project of cultivation. It's gardening. It's getting the things to do the things that the things can do without knowing actually what they're doing, but putting it in the right sort of soil, a multiculture that puts the right plants together in order to get the right sorts of, et cetera. And if the problem is a problem of definition, Rich, of saying, you know, thou shall and thou shall not in advance, well, I mean, the human itself is getting toyed with in ways that are not just material but are also conceptual, and it seems to me speak back to the very sort of prescinding from definitional commitment that Maritain points to as the condition of possibility for arriving at a consensus in the first place. So I wonder if you would reflect on that problem, the definition not as an a priori problem, but as an output of the dynamics in each of the domains that you talked about.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That was louder than the last part of your question. But, well, I don't want to insist on, sort of apodictic definitions. But I think that the point of, what many philosophers and others are talking about now in terms of a richer notion of the human person and of human dignity means that there are some definitions that are truncated and just too impoverished. I am not my part, even the part that is my ever trying to control will. And that opens up greater meaning for what the human person is and what our aspirations are than you can get from just saying, dignity is autonomy and everything that we can think of trying to do with ourselves is right because we might be able to do it. And so I think it's important to make distinctions, but I think even the distinction between therapy and enhancement has blurry lines in it. I like to say that, the existence of twilight does not eliminate the difference between night and day, but there are places where if you're, for example, giving somebody a resistance to a certain disease that is very rare in nature, and one Chinese scientist, of course, tried to do that with resistance to HIV, is that therapy or enhancements? And some humans already have it, and those are all worth working out. But I think when you begin, as was illustrated here, when you begin taking human nature itself as just raw material, that's crossing a line that I think most people can realize raises other concerns.
So, to the point about this, these distinctions that are coming out of these sort of gardening paradigm experiments, it really, I mean, we're face to face with a mystery. Like you said, part of the power of these gardening paradigm experiments is we don't need to know how it works. We don't know fully how it works. We know certain little things, but we're face to face with a mystery, and ultimately, in these human embryonic stem cell experiments or pluripotent stem cell experiments, we're face to face with the mystery of our own existence. And it reminds me of, the great Christian traditions of thought face to face with the mystery of God, some of which tremble to comment with too many distinctions on what exactly God is, and some of which are more bold to tread into that space and try to, carve up the area with categories and descriptions. And at the heart of what I'm presenting is just a thrust to say, let's adopt this reverence that James is talking about. Let's see the beauty and the mastery of what's happening in our bodies and pause here. What is the greed? What's the greed perhaps that's driving our need to really clarify these definitions? Because I think sometimes we can be face to face with the mystery and we don't have to carve that space up nicely and neatly. What is it that's driving us to do that?
Friends, please join me in thanking our speakers.